Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest Bible Challenge talk. Today, we're going to be thinking about Numbers and Joshua. So, there's a little bit of context. That's the library of books that is the Bible. And we can see that Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Joshua come at the top there. We're just today going to look at Numbers and Joshua. Deuteronomy is going to be for another time. So, these are early on in the Old Testament. We're in this period in the gap here, where Israel have come out of Egypt and they're about to go into the Promised Land. Okay, so this is a period after people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but before characters like Saul, David, and Solomon. This is the time of Moses and Joshua. So let's start with the book of Numbers. So to get some fundamentals, then the title, okay, well, we know it's Numbers, which is its name in English Bibles, which has taken it from Latin and Greek that uses titles with the same meaning. But the Hebrew title in the Hebrew Old Testament from which these were translated is In the Wilderness. Okay, and we'll look at those two titles because they tell us something about the contents of the book as we go on. The author, well, it's not stated. There's nothing in the book that tells us who wrote it. Traditionally, it's considered to be Moses. In fact, some Bibles call it the fourth book of Moses, but it doesn't actually say so in the pages itself, and nor does it say directly in other parts of the Bible. The date, well, the events it's recording are between 1200 and 1400 before Christ, depending on which chronology you follow. In terms of when it was written, there's different views about whether it was written fairly close to that time or whether it was written sometime later, looking back on this period in Israel's history. Now, even though we don't know exactly when it was written, we do have some very early extracts from the Book of Numbers. So this is something known as the Ketef Hinnom Silver Scrolls. And these were discovered in 1979 in Jerusalem. They're not biblical manuscripts as we would normally understand them. It'd be difficult to have a whole scroll of silver. These are little miniature scrolls that were used as sort of amulets. I think were sometimes used in burials or other customs. And these are the oldest surviving text we have of the Bible, going back to 600 years before Christ. So these are many hundred years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they are just very small extracts from Scripture. And the words that are here, if you know one or two characters of Hebrew, you might be able to pick out the name of God, Yahweh, there in the part that I've highlighted. And in fact, here's the translation. Yahweh keep you, make shine Yahweh his face upon you and grant you peace. Now, this is incomplete, as we can see, which is why the words are incomplete. But if you know Numbers chapter 6, you might recognize those words. In our English Bible, it says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So, Numbers chapter 6 is certainly one of the earliest recorded pieces of scripture that we have. Okay, whether this is a direct quote from number 6 or whether it has some other connection is again a little uncertain, but we certainly know that Numbers dates back many hundreds of years before the time of Christ. So in terms of its geographical setting, Well, remember it's called In the Wilderness, and by that we mean the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so what today is part of Egypt, bordering Israel. You can see that red line is where the Israelites wandered during their journeys from Egypt to the Promised Land for a period of 40 years. And so much of what happens in the book of Numbers takes place in that area, takes place along that red route that we can see. Okay, now just some context that might help us understand the message of Numbers. It would be good if you've got a Bible to hand for this, because I think if you follow along with me, you might see these things and remember them a little bit more. So please turn to the book of Leviticus and chapter 1, because this helps us see where Numbers is following on from. Okay, Leviticus chapter 1. The book opens with these words. Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying. Okay, so the tabernacle of meeting is the tent of worship that had been established in the wilderness while Israel were wandering there. Now turn over to the book of Numbers and look at the first verse of the book of Numbers and see if you can spot an important difference. Here's what it says. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of meeting. Okay, now you might have said, yeah, it talks about the wilderness of Sinai. That's true. There's a more important difference, which is here. In Leviticus, God spoke to him from. In Numbers, God spoke to him in the tabernacle. Okay, now you think, well, what difference does that make? Well, let's think about the situation of the position of Moses. If God calls to Moses from the tabernacle, that means God is inside the tabernacle and Moses is outside the tabernacle. And so Moses is standing outside and hears God's voice coming from the temple of meeting. But when we get to Numbers, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tabernacle of meeting. That means God is in the tabernacle and Moses is in the tabernacle. So between Leviticus chapter 1 and Numbers chapter 1, Moses has moved from outside the tabernacle to inside the tabernacle. How has that happened? Well, that's what Leviticus was all about. If you remember back to our previous Bible challenge about the book of Leviticus, then we noticed that a lot of it is about holiness and purification so that people are able to approach the holiness of God. Okay, God's presence symbolically is there in the tabernacle, and in order to approach to God, people have to make themselves holy through offerings and sacrifices and rituals. And so this shows that because Moses is now in the tabernacle, he's now in the presence of God, this first stage of purification of holiness has taken place. Leviticus has been successful, and there's now this closer relationship between God and Moses as leader of the people. So that takes us to one of the themes of the book of Numbers, which is all about law and holiness. And so this tabernacle that had been set up, there were all sorts of rules about the priesthood and how the offering should be carried out and the festivals that were to be observed and how the nation as a whole were to be involved in that. And so we find that there are lots of things about what the Levites, what the servants of the place of worship had to do, all sorts of things about how to not be defiled so that your holiness or your purity wasn't taken away. how the tabernacle and the Levites were consecrated, made holy, the offerings that had to be prescribed, things about priests and purification, all of those things link to this idea of law and holiness, that God was giving his people instructions in order to bring them closer to himself. Now, another theme is fulfilled promises. If you think back to the book of Genesis, our first Bible challenge, then you might recognize these words. This is one of the promises to Abraham. Then God, brought him, Abraham, outside and said, "Look now toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." So one of the promises to Abraham was that he was going to have many descendants. And so when we get to the book of Numbers, the numbers that we read about are a census. It's the numbering of the people. Okay? And both at the beginning of Numbers and at the end of Numbers, there are around 600,000 people. So despite everything that's happened, God's promise has been fulfilled. God is still faithful to his promise. The nation of Israel are in huge number. They have multiplied massively from the beginning of Exodus, when there was only 70 or so who came into the land of Egypt. And now they are a nation of 600,000 fighting men. So we might think, well, why do we need to know about numbers? Why do we need to know about tribes? What's the relevance of this? It's telling us, it's showing us that God's promise is being fulfilled and his people, the descendants of Abraham, are multiplying. Now, one of the other promises to Abraham was, "To your descendants I have given this land." That was the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel, that Abraham was living in at the time. "I've given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." So much larger territory than we think of as the land of Israel today. And so when we get to the book of Numbers, then we find them viewing the land, just like Abraham was able to view the land he was going to inherit. So the people, represented by the spies, go into the land and view what God has promised them. And then the kind of conquest against the nation starts. It starts with Midian, which isn't actually one of those that had been promised to Abraham, but it's kind of an illustration of how Israel were to be a military force fighting against the nations that opposed them. And then as the book goes on, they are preparing for conquest of the land, and God is giving them instructions about that. Another promise is, "I will bless those who bless you, I will curse him who curses you." And though that was said to Abraham specifically, there's a sense in which it was true to the nation as a whole. And we see that exemplified in Numbers, where Balaam, who is one of Israel's enemies, tries to prophesy against them, but is made by God to bless them instead. Okay, and we have there an illustration again of that promise to Abraham. Another theme is the wilderness. Okay, that was the Hebrew title, wasn't it? In the wilderness. And so it's no surprise that there's lots about what happened in those years in the wilderness. There's 3 sections. There's a section when they're at Sinai, okay, which is the same as where they were in the book of Exodus. There's a long section from chapters 10 to 22 where they're journeying through the wilderness for a period of 38 years. And then there's a final section where they are encamped in Moab on the borders of the Promised Land, waiting to go in. Now, unfortunately, that all sounded so promising, didn't it? That we've got God's covenant to Abraham being fulfilled. We've got this progress to the Promised Land. And yet all the way through Numbers, there's rebellion. It's the people complaining. It's then Miriam and Aaron, who are Moses' own brother and sister. They rise up against him. Even though they've been given this wonderful promised land, they refuse to enter it because of their fears. God's judgments come or are threatened as a result of that, and it takes Moses' intercession in order to restore the relationship between God and his people. And then there's more rebellion. There's the rebellion of Korah, once more against Moses. Moses himself ends up disobeying God by striking the rock to bring forth water. The people complain again, and there's a whole incident with disease where they have to receive healing by looking at a bronze snake. There's a period where they engage in sexual immorality with one of the nations around, the Moabites. And because of that, God's judgments again have to be averted by the intercession of Phinehas, one of the priests of Israel. Okay, so there's a lot there to take in, but we can kind of see the theme. It's about rebellion and disobedience of everybody, of the people, of the leaders of the people, of Moses' family, and Moses himself. Okay, this looks like an absolute disaster, doesn't it? It's only averted by the actions of Moses, the leader of the people, and Phinehas, one of the priests. So Israel is shown to be in a sorry state through much of the record of the Book of Numbers. So that's Numbers. That gives us a little overview of the book. Let's move on then to Joshua. Now, just to remind ourselves, we have got a book in between Numbers and Joshua. We've got the book of Deuteronomy that we're not going to talk about today. However, Deuteronomy is basically a long speech by Moses that he gave over a few days or weeks. So between the end of Numbers and the beginning of Joshua is probably only a few weeks in time. Yeah, remember we said at the book of Numbers they were camping in the plains of Moab, ready to go into the land, and then Deuteronomy happens. Moses gives his speech and dies, and Joshua opens with the people a few weeks later, still in the same place, ready to go into the land under a new leader, Joshua. And so the title, of course, is Joshua. That's true in all languages. Okay, there's no confusion like there was with the book of Numbers. The author, again, it's not stated. Traditionally, people have suggested, well, it's Joshua himself. It could be a book by Joshua or a book about Joshua. There's nothing directly to tell us either way. Once again, it's the same period, depending on which chronology you follow, somewhere between 1200 and 1400 years before Christ. And as with the book of Numbers, it could have been written closer to the time, it could have been written sometime later. There's some debate about that. What we can say, though, is the book of Joshua really gives a new beginning. We saw how kind of depressing, really, the book of Numbers was, where the people failed time and time and time and time again, and they get to the end and they're still not in the promised land, and Moses isn't allowed in the promised land, and a whole generation has died out, but a new generation has come on the scene. And in fact, that was why there had to be a second census in the book of Numbers, because of this new generation. So with this new generation, we've got a new book and a new beginning in the book of Joshua. We've got a new leader to replace Moses. God renews his promise. He promises to be with his people and to give the land to them and to be with them as they conquer the land. The spies go out a second time. These are obviously different spies. This is a later generation, but it's a second spying out of the land. Once again, they cross the water. This time they're not crossing the Red Sea with Moses. they cross the River Jordan with Joshua. The covenant of circumcision, which goes right back to the time of Abraham and hadn't really been kept while they're in the wilderness, that's renewed. Okay, so this is all about the renewal of the nation, the renewal of God's relationship with the nation, and then they begin the conquest of the land. It's all looking so positive, and then Israel are defeated. And so we've got this situation where we had something so positive and optimistic at the beginning, just like we had in the book of Numbers, as Moses was able to speak to God in the tabernacle, and yet shortly after, everything goes wrong again. And here we've got it in the book of Joshua. All of this new beginning has culminated in Israel's defeat. Why? Because one of their number had taken from the spoil of the city of Jericho that had been forbidden, and so the nation suffered as a result. And so we have a new start, which follows from that. The covenant with God, the agreement that God had made with his people, is renewed at the city of Shechem, in a place of great significance to the nation and to their history with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the book continues then with the conquest of the land. So the people of Israel make a treaty with one of the tribes in the land, the Gibeonites. They then fight campaigns in the south and in the north to defeat several of the Canaanite cities across the land and take possession of it. And then there's a summary at the end of that section in chapters 11 and 12, just saying what cities they had conquered in that time. Now, we then leap forward in time to the end of Joshua's life, and the land hasn't been completely conquered, but God tells Joshua to divide the land up among the people of Israel and into their tribal areas. And so we've got a whole load of chapters, which a lot of it is just geographical details, names of places, and who these were given to. It also gives us a list of special cities. So there was two sets of special cities, one which was for the Levites. So remember those servants of the tabernacle, of the place of worship, who had a particular job to teach the people about God's work and to organize the worship that the nation did. So they had particular cities around the land that were given to them so that they could be a force for good right across the land rather than just centered in one place of worship. And the other set of special cities was a subcategory of those called the cities of refuge. And this was a place that you could flee for justice and for safety if you had been guilty of certain crimes such as manslaughter. Once again, it all starts to go horribly wrong because we've got Joshua chapter 22. Once all of this conquest of the land has happened, once the land has been divided up, then there's this dispute between different groups of tribes to do with a misinterpretation of intention around setting up an altar, and they nearly go to war against one another. Fortunately, they have a debate, a discussion together, and that civil war is averted. And then the book closes with Joshua renewing the covenant with the whole of the nation once more at Shechem. You can perhaps see there that that structure has kind of a similarity. In both cases, we've got two sections, both ending with the covenant being renewed after some major crisis in the nation's history. And so this was how the land was to look, divided up into areas for each of the tribes of Israel. Now, there's a little question which sometimes comes up with the book of Joshua, and to a lesser extent the book of Numbers, and that is, isn't this genocide if we've got the nation of Israel coming into a land and eliminating its previous inhabitants, or fighting against a nation and wiping out everybody, even including women and children? How does this fit with our ideas of justice, our expectation of a God of justice and a God of love? How would this be an example to the nations around Israel? And so it's think about what some of the kind of counter arguments to that are. I think it's not fair to use this word genocide. I think that's a sort of mischaracterization of the situation. If we just think about the situation that led up to this, remember that the land had been promised to Abraham's descendants centuries before. Okay, this didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't just the nation taking land opportunistically. And God had given a reason that the Canaanites were to be dispossessed, and that was because of their wickedness. Okay, so this was a cleansing of the land of wickedness, not specifically of a group of people. They've had ample warning of Israel coming. They'd been in the wilderness that time. God had done signs that should have demonstrated to the nations round about that this was a nation that was specially kept and loved by God. So that should have at least given them some indication that what God had said was going to come true. Like we said, this was going to be a moral cleansing, not the ethnic cleansing that it's sometimes characterized by. This wasn't about asking whether people were descended from Abraham, and if they weren't, slaughtering them. It wasn't about speaking a particular language or having a particular skin color. It was about whether they were going to join themselves to the people of God and the laws of God, or were they going to continue in their wickedness and rebellion against God? And so people had the opportunity to join Israel. They could do that individually, as somebody called Rahab did, or they could do it collectively. For example, the Gibeonites, who became part of the community of Israel, even though they had Canaanite origins. There's also a suggestion that some of the language in the book of Joshua around utter destruction may, in some contexts, be a kind of hyperbole, a sort of kind of literary exaggeration, which is used to show, how fully the land had been given to God's people, Israel. But it certainly isn't entirely what happened in reality, because we find in the book of Joshua, and also in the biblical books that follow, there were many of those Canaanites who remained there. There was a certain coexistence, not particularly peaceful, but it's not that the Canaanites were completely eliminated by the wars of Joshua. Okay, so that's our Bible challenge for the book of Joshua. Now, just to finish then, let's think about how this is relevant for us. These are old books set in a time and place very disconnected from our own. And we might think, well, what does this have to do with me today in the 21st century as a follower of Jesus? These books don't even mention Jesus. This is long before. Well, I think it's important to see this as part of the story of God's ongoing work with his people. Okay, the work of God didn't begin with Jesus. It began right at the beginning of creation. And the story of Israel is part of that work of God with the people that he has called and the people that have joined themselves to the family of God. And Jesus is a key part, the most key part of that ongoing story. But this whole story is relevant to us, even the parts which predate the time of Jesus. they explain to us how God's promises have been fulfilled. So we saw the promises to Abraham. We're seeing them in the book of Numbers and Joshua being fulfilled in part, and they are fulfilled in a much fuller sense when we get to the life and work of Jesus. More generally, seeing the incidents that happen in these books show us the consequences of disobedience. Perhaps in our own day, we don't see the consequences of sin so evidently often, whereas the things that happen in these books are pretty shocking sometimes, extreme, where thousands of people die as a result of rebellion and foolishness or false worship. And so it does give us a very clear warning of the importance of obeying God and keeping faithful to the covenant that we have made if we have joined with Christ in baptism. There's lots of encouragement in these books as well. Remember the new starts we've seen, the fact that despite those rebellions in the book of Numbers, God was faithful to his promise. He did bring them to the borders of the promised land. Think about the book of Joshua, and despite Achan's sin, there was the opportunity for the covenant to be renewed as part of that new start that had come through Joshua. And Joshua and Moses give us glimpses of Jesus. Okay, they show us something about what Jesus is like. They foreshadow him. There's events in their lives that have very close parallels. And in fact, Joshua is the same name as Jesus. Okay, Joshua is the Hebrew version. Jesus is the Greek version of the name. And so the name that God chose for his son was Joshua. That should tell us something about how Jesus and Joshua relate. There's also in these books glimpses of how sin has been conquered. So just as Israel's enemies, the nations around them, were conquered, so through Christ we can conquer the battle over sin and death. And as part of that, there's also glimpses of God's kingdom. There's parallels between the taking of the land that had been promised, and the giving of the kingdom to God's people at the return of Christ. So that's our Bible challenge for today. Hopefully that's given you a little taster of the books of Numbers and Joshua and given you things to think about as you read them yourself. Thanks very much for listening.